Welcome back to my channel, where we uncover the forgotten corners of the past. Today, I'm taking you into a story about a woman whose chilling criminal enterprise was built on a foundation of human misery, a mystery buried in the dust of time, a truth that will send shivers down your spine. But before we embark on this journey, take a moment to let me know where are you listening to this story from. That helps me understand how far these secrets have traveled, and if this story truly captivates you, if it makes you ponder. Don't hesitate to give me a like and subscribe to the channel to keep me going. Together, we'll explore the darkest pages of history, and you won't want to miss a thing. In the serene and deceptively tranquil spring of 1829, a diligent tenant farmer, a man of simple, unadorned habits and hands hardened by a lifetime of honest labor, was methodically plowing the rich, dark soil of his fields near the Delaware-Maryland border. His mind was a calm and predictable landscape, focused on the immediate future, on the planting of corn and the hopes of a bountiful harvest that would see his family through the lean, cold months of the coming year. The morning dew still clung to the lush, green grass, each droplet a tiny prism reflecting the nascent golden sunlight, and the crisp, clean air carried the familiar, comforting scents of pine and damp earth, a scent that for him was the very smell of honest, uncompromised toil. The only sound for miles around was the gentle, rhythmic creak of his leather harness and the steady, familiar plod of his plow horse. A sound that had been a constant companion since his boyhood. It was a picture of perfect rural tranquility, a scene of pastoral life that had played out on this land for countless generations. Suddenly, that familiar, predictable rhythm was brutally and catastrophically broken. With a sickening lurch and a deep, unsettling groan from the earth itself, the horse's right hoof sank deep into a soft, unexpected patch of ground, as if the soil beneath it were not solid and firm, but a chilling, yielding void. The animal whinnied in sheer panic, its powerful legs flailing in the thick, sucking mud as it struggled desperately to free itself from the hidden trap. Concerned and utterly bewildered by this unnatural give in the ground, the farmer quickly unhitched the plow, his heart pounding with a sense of foreboding he couldn't explain. He began to dig, not just to free his trapped animal, but to satisfy a morbid curiosity about the ground's strange resistance. His shovel struck something with a dull, wooden thud. He initially thought it might be an old, long-forgotten fence post, a common hazard in these parts. But the sound was wrong. It was hollow, and the resistance was strangely yielding. As he cleared away the wet, clotted soil, his hands touched a layer of rotten, crumbling wood that gave way to a horror buried just beneath the surface. Instead of roots or rocks, he found the telltale shape of human bones, yellowed and brittle with age, neatly arranged within what appeared to be a rudimentary wooden chest, now little more than a pile of splinters and dust. The farmer, a man accustomed to the hardships of life, was so stunned he could only stare, his mind struggling to comprehend the grim contents. These were the first relics, the first terrifying whispers from a mass grave that had lain in silent anonymity for almost 2 decades. A secret kept by the very earth itself, waiting for a chance encounter to reveal its grisly contents. The news of his discovery spread through the local community like a brush fire, igniting a flicker of suspicion that had long been dormant. That accidental discovery was not an isolated incident. It was just the harrowing beginning, as local authorities, now alerted to the grim find by a shaken and pale farmer, began a systematic and painstaking excavation of the entire property. a truly chilling and agonizing truth was slowly and methodically unearthed. The initial chest contained the skeletal remains of a man, his skull bearing the clear, unmistakable signs of blunt force trauma. But as they continued to dig, their shovels hit more hidden burial sites, each discovery a fresh wave of dread that washed over the investigative team. What followed were more bodies, some buried hastily and without ceremony in shallow graves, others seemingly placed with a disturbing, cold precision in primitive coffins, their hands and feet often bound by rusted iron manacles. The investigators, hardened by years of dealing with death and violence, were visibly shaken by the sheer scale of the findings. In total, at least 7 sets of human remains were discovered on the property, including those of 3 children, a detail that sent a profound, gut-wrenching chill through every person on the investigative team, solidifying the realization that this was not a simple crime, but a deep-seated pathology. This was the dark and forgotten legacy of a woman whose name had already become a whispered terror throughout the swampy lowlands of the Delmarva Peninsula. A name that would go down in history as a symbol of pure, unadulterated evil, Martha Patty Cannon. The horror wasn't just in the sheer brutality of the acts themselves, but in the chilling and meticulously organized nature of a criminal enterprise that had operated with stunning efficiency and utter heartlessness. These victims had not been randomly discarded. They had been laid to rest on a plot of land she once owned. A grim and silent testament to a reign of terror that few dared to speak of. A stain upon the very landscape that time itself had failed to erase. The revelation was not just of murder, but of a systematic depravity so vast it was almost incomprehensible. A machine of human misery running in plain sight. To truly understand who Patty Cannon was, and how she came to commit such heinous crimes with such chilling impunity, we must travel back in time to a land where the law seemed to lose its very authority. Where justice was an abstract concept and not a guarantee. In the early 19th century, this secluded and swampy region, then known as Johnson's Crossroads, sat at a chaotic intersection of 3 jurisdictions, Sussex County in Delaware and Caroline and Dorchester counties in Maryland. This geographical complexity created a perfect gray area, a legal no-man's land where law enforcement officers often found their warrants and authority rendered useless the moment a suspect simply stepped across an unmarked property line. One step across that muddy border was often all it took to escape the reach of justice, to become untouchable. The landscape itself conspired with the criminals. Dense forests of pine and oak stretched for miles, broken only by treacherous marshy lowlands and small, isolated farmsteads. The Nanticoke River and its countless tributaries wound through the region, providing silent, watery highways for clandestine travel under the cover of a moonless night. It was a wilderness designed for concealment, a labyrinth of water and trees where secrets could be kept and human beings could disappear without a trace, swallowed by the land itself. More than that, the historical and social context of the time created a fertile, corrupt ground for depravity to take root and flourish. In 1808, the U.S. Congress officially banned the importation of enslaved people from Africa. This pivotal moment, far from ending the trade, caused the value of domestic enslaved people to skyrocket, creating a massive and lucrative internal market that dwarfed the overseas trade it replaced. The demand for labor in the burgeoning cotton fields of the Deep South became insatiable, and the legal ban meant that the only source of new stock was the existing population. This made free people of color, particularly in regions like the Delmarva Peninsula with their substantial free African American populations, a new and horrifyingly vulnerable commodity for these communities. Every passing stranger was a potential threat, and fear was a constant companion. They lived in a society where their word carried little to no weight in a court of law, and where their disappearances were often ignored or actively uninvestigated by a white-dominated authority that viewed them as inherently less than human. It was a cruel and brutal reality that ruthless individuals like Patty Cannon exploited to their full. Malevolent advantage, turning human beings into nothing more than currency to be bought, sold, and disposed of. She emerged in that treacherous environment, not with the appearance of a criminal, but with the quiet facade of a seemingly ordinary widow. Martha Patty Cannon was a woman living on a modest farm near the state line, a figure who should have been unremarkable. However, her ordinariness was a fragile and deceptive facade. Historical accounts describe her as a physically imposing and unusually strong woman for her time, standing nearly 6 feet tall in an era when most women were far shorter and more delicate. Her voice was reportedly deep, gravelly, and commanding, and she had what neighbors and associates described as a profoundly intimidating presence that could silence a room with a single icy glance. She was a woman who was not to be trifled with, and her physical stature was a powerful visual tool she used to enforce her will. Her home, a simple 2-story wooden structure with thick walls and small fortified windows, was also far from ordinary. Beneath its placid exterior, a sinister secret was kept. Rumors and later undeniable evidence would reveal that the home was equipped with secret rooms and hidden cellars specifically constructed and reinforced to conceal human beings. Iron rings were said to be set deep into the stone walls, serving as cold, unyielding anchor points for chains. It was not a home, but a clandestine prison. The terrifying first stop on what historians would later call the reverse Underground Railroad that Patty Cannon was building, a dark mirror of the path to freedom. This profound and haunting contrast between the tranquil facade of a rural woman and the ruthless, calculating nature of a criminal mastermind is what makes the story of Patty Cannon so profoundly and enduringly chilling, a testament to the darkness that can hide in plain sight. The transformation of Martha Patty Cannon from a reclusive widow into a criminal mastermind was not an isolated or sudden event, but a meticulous, insidious evolution. It was a gradual descent into the deepest pits of depravity, a journey that began not with an act of her own, but through a seemingly natural life event that would set a cascade of horrors into motion: the marriage of a daughter. Her first son-in-law, a blacksmith named Henry Brighton, was not just a craftsman of metal. He was a cold, calculating kidnapper who supplemented his meager income by preying upon and seizing free African Americans for sale in the unforgiving southern markets. His legitimate profession offered a perfect, insidious cover. As a blacksmith, he had a justifiable reason to travel the remote, winding back roads of the peninsula, to visit isolated farms and settlements, to speak with travelers and merchants. With every horseshoe he fitted and every tool he mended, he was also surveying his next potential victims, meticulously noting which families had young, healthy members who might fetch a high price in the slave markets of Georgia and Alabama. He was an artist of deception, a predator in plain sight. Brighton's methods were often as crude as his trade, relying heavily on deception and the profound vulnerability of rural life. He would approach desperate families with tantalizing, yet ultimately false, offers of stable employment in faraway places like Philadelphia or New York. His words were smooth and reassuring, preying on parents who only wanted a better life for their children. The offer was a siren's call, a melody of false hope that lured these young souls into a meticulously set trap. Their fate was sealed not with violence, but with the false promise of a brighter future for the victims. The psychological betrayal was as devastating as the physical one. It was the crushing of hope, the ultimate disillusionment. These were not just opportunistic crimes. They were a calculated exploitation of hope and a profound betrayal of trust that turned the American dream into a waking nightmare. The first small drops of what would become a growing river of human misery flowed from these initial deceptive acts, laying the groundwork for a more organized, more brutal form of evil. The veneer of simple thievery, however, would not last for long. Brighton's criminal activities eventually led to his arrest and imprisonment in Sussex County. The legal system, slow and often ineffective in this region, had finally caught up to him, and though he would escape jail, an event that became a local legend. The incident seemed to light a fuse within Patty Cannon. The first documented murder directly linked to the family's operation occurred in 1812, just after Brighton's dramatic escape, with Patty and a confederate named Joseph Griffith. They ambushed a slave trader known only as Rigdale at Cannon's Tavern. The plan was as brutal as it was simple: lure the man, get him drunk and complacent, rob him of his cash and any enslaved people he was traveling with, and then silence the witness to remove all trace of the crime. Rigdale was shot and killed in cold blood, his body buried in a shallow, unmarked grave. The murder marked a significant and horrifying escalation, a chilling turning point where the family's involvement went from facilitating kidnappings to committing cold-blooded murder for profit and concealment. It was a brutal baptism in blood that proved Patty Cannon's willingness to cross any line, to break any moral barrier, for power and greed. The lesson she drew from Brighton's capture and eventual execution was not a moral one of consequence and punishment. Instead, it was a brutal, pragmatic, and tactical one. She realized that to thrive in this dark and treacherous world, a criminal enterprise needed better organization, more ruthless planning, and, most importantly, a more secure and strategically positioned base of operations that the law could not easily penetrate. This stark, brutal realization led her to a new and far more dangerous partnership, this time with a man named Joseph Johnson, her daughter's new husband after Brighton's death. Johnson was more than a simple kidnapper. He was a shrewd businessman with a wide network of connections stretching across the South. He brought to the partnership not only a significant amount of capital, the lifeblood of their growing enterprise, but, more importantly, a perfectly positioned tavern on the Delaware-Maryland state line. This geographical quirk was a masterstroke of criminal logistics. The tavern, known as Joe Johnson's Tavern, was intentionally built in such a way that different rooms literally sat in different states, allowing suspects to take a single step across an invisible line and claim legal immunity from the lawmen who were just a few feet away. The state line was not a boundary, but a shield, a cruel joke on the very concept of justice. This strategic and cynical location turned the tavern into the nerve center of a far more sophisticated and effective operation. It was a legitimate business that provided the perfect cover for their activities, a clandestine holding facility with specially constructed hidden rooms and cellars to conceal their human cargo, and a central meeting place where a sprawling network of criminals could gather, make their plans, and divide their ill-gotten profits. The horrifying details of these holding cells would only come to light much later, through the harrowing testimony of those who survived. Iron rings were set deep into the stone walls of the cellars, serving as permanent anchor points for chains. Small, narrow ventilation shafts provided just enough air to keep captives from suffocating in the suffocating darkness, but not enough to provide comfort. The psychological torture was as brutal as the physical conditions. As captives, stripped of their names, their identities, and their dignity, knew they were destined for a lifetime of bondage in the Deep South. The gang that assembled around Cannon and Johnson was a motley crew, a diverse collection of outlaws, runaway slaves, and opportunistic villains who used their various backgrounds to their advantage, all serving the same monstrous goal: the ruthless exploitation of human life for profit. As the 1820s progressed, the scale of their operation expanded dramatically, a horrifying testament to their ruthless efficiency and the systemic failure of justice. The network stretched from the bustling streets of Philadelphia down to the isolated plantations of the Mississippi Delta, a chilling and sinister reverse of the heroic Underground Railroad. Mayor Joseph Watson of Philadelphia, a Quaker committed to protecting free African Americans, began to notice a horrifying pattern in the disappearances of his city's citizens. His dogged and tireless investigations uncovered the horrifying scope of the operation, documenting dozens of kidnappings connected to the Cannon Gang in 1825 alone. The victims were not random. They were systematically chosen for their vulnerability. Young, able-bodied adults brought the highest prices, while children were valuable for the decades of unpaid labor they could provide. The systematic and calculating nature of these kidnappings revealed a level of organization that went far beyond mere opportunistic crime. It was a well-oiled machine of human trafficking, a business run with cold, logistical precision. One of the most crucial and harrowing accounts comes from Lydia Smith, a 25-year-old free woman kidnapped in 1825. Her preserved testimony, a legal document and a rare first-hand account, offers a rare window into the terrifying reality of life inside the gang's stronghold. She described being held in Cannon's own house and later moved to Johnson's Tavern, where she was kept in chains for 5 months. Her words paint a picture of constant, low-grade fear, inadequate food, and the soul-crushing knowledge that she was slated to be transported south with a large group of other kidnapped people. Smith's testimony provided crucial details about the conditions endured by the victims. She described a network of secret underground rooms and cellars where dozens of people were kept at a time. Men, women, and children, all chained to the walls, awaiting their grim fate. They were systematically stripped of any documentation proving their free status, given new names, and beaten if they resisted. It was a factory of human misery, hidden in plain sight, a silent nightmare in the American wilderness. Lydia Smith's testimony, combined with the efforts of Mayor Watson, would ignite a public outcry that finally, after years of silence and complicity, would turn the full weight of the law toward the dark secrets of the Delmarva Peninsula. Her survival was not just a miracle, it was the key that unlocked the terrifying truth. The harrowing and meticulously detailed testimony of Lydia Smith was more than a story of survival. It was the first piece of concrete, unassailable evidence that transformed a local rumor into a national crisis, a whispered fear into a documented atrocity, delivered with a quiet yet unwavering resolve. Her words painted a chilling picture for the assembled investigators, who had for so long been chasing shadows. Her voice, though soft, seemed to fill the room with the ghosts of the captive souls she had known. She spoke not just of her own ordeal, a 5-month-long nightmare in chains, but of a methodical and terrifying routine of capture, containment, and transport, with chilling precision. She described the interior of Joe Johnson's tavern, confirming the presence of iron manacles set deep into the stone walls of the cellars, and of the suffocating secret rooms where human beings were held as nothing more than chattel. Her memory was a painful chronicle of suffering, a testament to a captor's brutal efficiency. She recalled the constant, low-grade fear that permeated the very air, the hollow echoes of moans from unseen chambers, and the sickening clank of chains as new captives were brought into the dark. her account, confirmed by the faint but unmistakable marks on the tavern's foundation, led Mayor Watson and his team back to the desolate stretch of land near the Delaware-Maryland border. This was where a farmer's plow had initially uncovered the horror. This time, they came not with morbid curiosity, but with a grim, forensic purpose, guided by Smith's precise description of the gang's methods and hidden facilities. They began a systematic, block-by-block excavation of the entire property. It was a painstaking and gruesome process that would unearth a horror far greater and more extensive than anyone had imagined. What began as the grim whispers of a single mass grave just a week prior escalated into a deafening scream that echoed across the nation. As the digging continued, the investigators found not a single pit, but a complex, scattered cemetery of secrets, with bodies buried in various states of decay and dismemberment across the entire plot. The soil, once fertile and unassuming, was now a burial shroud, a catalogue of unspeakable evil. Forensic reports from the period confirmed that many of the remains bore the unmistakable signs of a brutal and agonizing death, from blunt force trauma to strangulation by rope or bare hands. The horror was in the details: a skull with a gaping hole from a gunshot, a spine twisted at an unnatural angle from a violent break, and worst of all, the tiny, fragile bones of children. Some remains were found with rusted chains still clinging to their brittle wrists and ankles, a silent, damning testament to the bondage they had suffered, even in death. The discovery of the remains of infants and toddlers, some no older than 4 or 5 years old, was a detail that shattered the emotional fortitude of even the most hardened lawmen. The sheer, deliberate cruelty of such an act defied all comprehension, transforming the site from a crime scene into a sacred, haunted ground. These were not just statistics. They were individuals, each with a name, a family, and a story violently cut short by the hand of avarice. The physical evidence was irrefutable, but the final, damning confirmation came from a trove of documents found within the tavern itself, meticulously kept ledgers and bills of sale hidden in a false-bottomed chest. The papers, scrawled in a crude but methodical hand, logged not barrels of whiskey or bushels of corn, but the stock of human beings, detailing their ages, sexes, and the prices they would fetch at market. These ledgers were a grotesque inventory of human misery, a ledger of souls reduced to mere numbers and figures, a chilling testament to the cold, dehumanizing business of human trafficking. With this overwhelming body of evidence, the law's slow grinding gears finally began to turn with purpose. The public's initial skepticism was replaced with a collective horror, and the name Patty Cannon began to spread like a venomous whisper across the eastern seaboard. But it was not Cannon's own confession that would tear the veil from the full scope of the atrocity. It was the confession of one of her co-conspirators, a man named Joe Miller, captured after a botched kidnapping attempt far from the sanctuary of Johnson's Tavern. Miller initially remained silent, a stone-faced criminal who thought he could outlast the law. But the weight of the evidence, the relentless pressure from investigators, and the sheer psychological strain of being in the heart of a public scandal proved too much for his criminal resolve. His confession, a chilling, rambling account filled with equal parts dread and a sickening pride in the efficiency of their operation, revealed a network of depravity far more extensive than even Mayor Watson had suspected. Miller spoke of the reverse Underground Railroad not as a metaphor, but as a literal, well-defined route of human trafficking, a dark mirror of the network that helped so many find freedom. He confessed to participating in dozens of kidnappings, detailing the routes that ran from the free states of the North down to the slave markets of the Deep South. A treacherous journey fraught with peril and violence. He described the grim efficiency of the system, a system designed to strip people of their humanity and reduce them to nothing more than a profitable commodity. His words confirmed the existence of a dark chain of command, a hierarchy of human misery. At the top was Joseph Johnson, the shrewd businessman who handled the sales and the finances, the one who made the entire enterprise profitable. Beneath him was Henry Brighton, the foot soldier who had initiated the crude acts of thievery and who had laid the violent foundation for the gang's existence. But at the very center, orchestrating the most horrifying details, was Patty Cannon herself. According to Miller, she was not just a figurehead, she was the brutal enforcer, the one who held the keys to the secret cellars and who decided the fate of those who resisted. He described her physical presence and intimidating nature as a constant source of fear for both captives and her own gang members. Her malevolent control was total and absolute, a twisted matriarch ruling over a kingdom of despair. The most chilling detail of Miller's confession was his admission to the cold-blooded murders of countless victims who had either put up too much of a fight or, more horrifyingly, were deemed too old, too young, or too sickly to be a profitable asset. These individuals, according to Miller, were simply disposed of, their remains buried in the mass grave that the farmer had so innocently stumbled upon, their existence erased by a pickaxe and a shovel. The land around Cannon's tavern, once a picture of rural tranquility, was revealed to be a silent, sprawling monument to unimaginable human evil. The confessions and the physical evidence led to a firestorm of public outrage that swept across the nation. The trials of Patty Cannon and her gang were not merely legal proceedings. They were a public spectacle, a morbid fascination that drew crowds of thousands to the small town of Georgetown, Delaware. The case captivated the public imagination, forcing the nation to confront the dark underbelly of its own economic system and the moral compromises it had made. Patty Cannon, now a figure of profound infamy, was tried on 4 counts of murder, the most damning of which was the murder of Rigdale, the slave trader. She pleaded not guilty, maintaining a cold, defiant silence throughout the proceedings. The legal system, however, was at a crossroads. While the evidence was overwhelming, the geographical complexities and legal ambiguities of the state lines made the trial a treacherous and complicated affair. Despite this, the jury, moved by the harrowing testimony and the gruesome evidence, returned a verdict of guilty. Her conviction was seen as a victory for justice, a rare moment of accountability in a world where such crimes often went unpunished. The consequences of the Cannon case reverberated far beyond the courtroom. While Patty Cannon's death in jail, reportedly by suicide, spared her from the gallows, her legacy was cemented in the annals of American crime. Her story, a morbid legend whispered in the dark, forced a fundamental shift in public perception. The case revealed with brutal clarity the existence of a systematic, well-organized human trafficking ring that preyed not on enslaved people, but on free African Americans, turning the very concept of freedom into a fragile illusion. Legislatures in both Delaware and Maryland were forced to re-examine their laws, passing stricter statutes to combat kidnapping and strengthen the legal protections for free African Americans. The incident also highlighted the deep-seated corruption and complicity that had allowed such a reign of terror to flourish for over 2 decades. The small, sleepy community of Johnson's Crossroads was forever stained, its peaceful facade ripped away to reveal the unspeakable horror buried beneath its soil. The name Patty Cannon became a chilling cautionary tale, a symbol of pure, unadulterated evil that lingered long after she was gone. A dark ghost haunting the land where her victims found their final, anonymous rest. The quiet of Johnson's crossroads, once a hallmark of its rural peace, was shattered, not by a scream, but by the relentless clamor of a nation's morbid curiosity. The discovery transformed the sleepy community into a theater of public grief and journalistic frenzy. Reporters from every major newspaper, from Baltimore to Philadelphia, descended upon the tavern, their boots tramping over soil that held the secrets of the dead. The air, once thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, now hung heavy with the sickly perfume of decay and the palpable weight of shame. Neighbors, who had lived side by side with the Cannon gang for decades, now looked at each other with suspicion and quiet accusation. The tavern, an edifice of silent complicity, became the epicenter of this communal trauma. Its weathered walls and innocuous facade now appeared as a monstrous mask, hiding a festering rot. This was the true collapse, not just of a criminal enterprise, but of a town's very identity. The foundations of trust and community were ripped away, revealing a moral vacuum. People spoke in hushed tones of how easily evil had integrated itself into their lives, how the smiles of the tavern's patrons and the jingle of coin had obscured the sounds of human misery from the cellar below. The psychological fallout was profound. Families who had long held on to the faint hope of a child's return, believing they had merely run away or been sold south, were now confronted with the horrifying finality of the mass grave. This was a different kind of horror, one that gnawed at the soul, the loss of hope, and the terrible certainty of a cruel death. The collective guilt was a physical presence, as palpable as the damp air that clung to the town. Every shared glance, every hushed conversation, every averted eye was a testament to the terrible, unspoken truth that they had all been complicit in their silence. The community, once a bastion of simple rural life, now felt like a stage, with the ghosts of the victims as the only true audience. The full scale of the operation would never be truly known. Official records, though meticulously kept by Mayor Watson's team, were a cold account of the bodies they could identify, the ledgers they could decipher, and the confessions they could extract. But the truth was far more vast and amorphous. The confession of Joe Miller, while damning, was merely a snapshot of a larger, more intricate web. The network, Miller hinted, extended far beyond the confines of Delaware and Maryland, reaching deep into the tangled undergrowth of the criminal underworld in a dozen states. He spoke of other stations, other dispatchers, but the details were fragmented, lost to a combination of his own limited knowledge and the self-preserving silence of a dying man. The fate of many of Cannon's associates, beyond those captured, remains a mystery. Some disappeared, their trails vanishing into the same dense forests that had swallowed their victims. What of the hundreds of names scrolled in her ledger, the stock that was sold but never recovered? They became a permanent part of the national consciousness as the missing souls of the Cannon gang. Their lives, reduced to a single line in a forgotten book, are a haunting reminder of the victims whose voices were silenced twice over once in life, and again in the historical record. The land itself became a grim monument. Locals began to call the area a Patty's Hollow, a name uttered only in hushed tones, a place where no one dared to build or farm. The folklore of the region shifted, filled with tales of ghostly figures wandering the roads at night, their chains rattling in the wind. The legacy of Patty Cannon was not just a historical footnote. It was a scar on the collective memory, a dark stain that bled through generations. Every creak of a floorboard, every whisper of the wind, every shadow at dusk seemed to carry with it the echo of a forgotten name, a lost life, a whispered prayer for a justice that would never come. The case of Patty Cannon stands as a chilling indictment of a society that could look away so easily. It forces us to confront a profound question: Was she an anomaly, a singular monster born of pure evil? Or was she a brutal symptom of a deeply flawed system, the legal system, which eventually brought her to justice? Had for decades been complicit through its inaction and ambiguity? The very notion of freedom was a flimsy legal concept for African Americans in border states, easily torn away by the greed of individuals like Cannon. Her story is a testament to the fragile nature of justice and the terrifying ease with which human lives can be commodified when the moral compass of a society has been corrupted. The confessions, the ledgers, the bones, they all serve as irrefutable proof that evil does not always wear a monstrous face. Sometimes it hides behind the veil of a respectable business, a local tavern, and a woman who was a mother, a wife, and a neighbor. This chilling normality is what makes a story so unsettling. It challenges the comforting belief that evil is easily recognizable, that it wears a monstrous face or operates on the fringes of society. Her story is a testament to the chilling truth that evil can be banal, that it can be a business, and that it can be an integral part of the society that condemns it. The case also serves as a sobering reminder of the historical fragility of human rights and the terrifying ease with which marginalized communities can be exploited. It asks us to consider, what are the moral compromises we are willing to make in the name of economic prosperity or social stability? Are we truly, as a society, removed from the dark shadows of the past? Or do we simply bury our uncomfortable truths deeper? The land around Johnson's Crossroads remains silent now, the tavern long gone. But the legacy of the Cannon Gang lingers in the folklore, in the historical record, and in the enduring questions about justice, complicity, and the darkness that lies just beneath the surface. Her story isn't just a ghost story about a haunted land. It is a ghost story about the haunting specter of our own shared history. The psychological aftershocks of the Cannon Gang's exposure were both immediate and long-lasting. A silent epidemic of mistrust that swept through to the Delmarva Peninsula, the very fabric of society, once woven with the threads of neighborly kindness and mutual respect, unraveled into a chaotic patchwork of suspicion and fear. Families who had regularly socialized at Johnson's Tavern now avoided eye contact, haunted by the knowledge that they may have shared a table with a killer, or, worse, that a victim's final moments may have transpired just feet below their feet. The silence that had once defined the rural landscape became a heavy, suffocating weight, filled with unspoken questions and quiet accusations. Farmers, whose fields bordered the tavern property, were unable to look at their own land without picturing the silent horrors buried beneath. The innocence of a simple life was irrevocably lost, replaced by a profound and gnawing cynicism. This psychological collapse was a new, unseen dimension of the crime, far more insidious than the physical brutality. The tavern itself became an effigy of the community's shame. People spoke of the building with a morbid reverence, its shadow casting a pall over the entire area. Eventually, it was abandoned and left to decay, a literal and symbolic monument to the rot that had festered within. Locals whispered that the tavern's cellar was haunted, not by a single ghost, but by the collective anguish of the hundreds of souls who had passed through its iron-barred doors. The legends of the reverse Underground Railroad grew and intertwined with the folklore of the region, evolving into a terrifying cautionary tale told to children to keep them from wandering too close to the woods. The story of Patty Cannon became a central figure in this dark mythology. She was not just a criminal. She became a boogeyman, a monstrous figure of a woman who preyed on the innocent and the lost. The terrifying detail of her gang's method, the use of a decoy to lure victims, the cold-blooded efficiency of their murders found new life in these tales, each retelling adding a new layer of grim fascination. The legacy of the gang was not just a legal record, it was a permanent, haunting mark on the cultural consciousness of the region. The trials and executions of Cannon's associates brought a temporary, shallow sense of justice. But for the countless victims who were never found, justice remained elusive. The names scrawled in her ledgers were a haunting litany of loss, a grim roster of lives that were never truly accounted for. These missing souls became a somber footnote in the history of the Underground Railroad, a dark parallel to the more celebrated stories of escape and freedom. The existence of these unaccounted for victims revealed a much larger, more terrifying truth that the Reverse Underground Railroad was not an isolated operation, but a sophisticated, interstate criminal enterprise that operated with impunity for decades. The case exposed the deep flaws in a legal system that was unprepared for such a complex crime and revealed the porous borders between free and slave states, which allowed criminals to exploit legal loopholes with ease. The final, unresolved mystery of the Cannon case is not her guilt, which was clear, but the full extent of the operation and the identities of those who escaped justice. The confessions of Miller and others provided a glimpse, but the full network remained in the shadows, a secret society of human traffickers who simply faded back into the dark. The ultimate significance of the Patty Cannon case lies in its profound philosophical implications. It forces us to confront the duality of human nature, the unsettling contrast between the respectable facade of a community and the unspeakable evil that can thrive within it. Patty Cannon was not a cloistered monster. She was a member of the community, a proprietor of a popular tavern, a mother and a wife. This terrifying normality is what makes a story so unsettling. It challenges a comforting belief that evil is easily recognizable, that it wears a monstrous face or operates on the fringes of society. Her story is a testament to the chilling truth that evil can be banal, that it can be a business, and that it can be an integral part of the society that condemns it. The case also serves as a sobering reminder of the historical fragility of human rights and the terrifying ease with which marginalized communities can be exploited. It asks us to consider what are the moral compromises we are willing to make in the name of economic prosperity or social stability. Are we truly, as a society, removed from the dark shadows of the past? Or do we simply bury our uncomfortable truths deeper? The land around Johnson's Crossroads remains silent now, the tavern long gone, but the legacy of the Cannon gang lingers in the folklore, in the historical record, and in the enduring questions about justice, complicity, and the darkness that lies just beneath the surface. Her story isn't just a ghost story about a haunted land. It is a ghost story about the haunting specter of our own shared history.